You think you can just question everything Michael has worked for and expect this family to stay silent? After all we've done to bring you into this life, don't act like this health scare suddenly gives you permission to tear open old books that were never meant for you to read. If you keep pushing on those asset numbers, you're not just hurting your marriage, you're risking everything this family has built together on the water. Michael doesn't need his wife playing detective behind his back. He needs loyalty, the kind that doesn't come with private investigators and whispered phone calls. And if you breathe one word of whatever you think you found to anyone outside this house, you'll learn exactly how fast family can close ranks when someone decides to become a problem. Hi, my name is Sophia Reynolds. I am 31 years old. I can still feel the exact moment those words from my mother-in-law landed. They didn't come out of nowhere. They arrived after weeks of small evasions that had started to pile up like unpaid bills I kept telling myself I'd deal with later. The health scare had been the thing that finally made me stop ignoring them. It began with a routine screening my doctor had recommended because of family history. Dr. Lena Patel's office called with the first set of results on a Tuesday morning while I was at my desk reviewing project timelines for the marine restoration grants I managed. The nurse's voice was careful professional, the kind that leaves just enough space for your mind to fill in the worst. More tests needed, nothing definitive yet. Come in soon. I hung up, sat there with the phone still in my hand, and realized I didn't want to carry uncertainty alone. That evening, I asked Michael about updating the beneficiary paperwork on the life insurance and the waterfront property holdings. We had talked about it months earlier when the estate planning came up, but he had brushed it off then too. This time, I was direct. I told him the doctor's office needed current asset information for some forms. He looked at me across the kitchen island, smiled the easy smile he used when he wanted a conversation to end, and said the numbers were exactly where they had always been. No changes. Nothing to worry about. Trust him. I did for a while. But the next morning, while Michael was out on the water checking one of the rental slips, I opened the folder of documents he kept in the home office. One page showed a property valuation that didn't match what I remembered from the last time we had discussed the estate. Another had a transfer date I didn't recognize. Small things, easy to explain away if you wanted to. I didn't want to anymore. I called Derek Vance that afternoon. He was the private investigator, a colleague at the conservation nonprofit had recommended years earlier for a different matter, someone who stayed quiet and delivered paper instead of drama. I asked him for a discreet records pull on Reynolds waterfront holdings and the personal accounts tied to the Annapolis properties. No surveillance, no contact with Michael, just what was already public or easily accessible through standard channels. Derek agreed without asking why. He sent the first report 3 days later. The discrepancies were there in black and white. 2 of the waterfront parcels were listed at values nearly 40% lower than the figures Michael had given me during our earlier conversations. There were transfers to an account I had never seen on any joint statement. The dates lined up with periods when Michael had told me business was tight and we needed to watch spending. I sat on the screened porch with the report in my lap, the pages fluttering in the breeze off the water, and felt something small and cold settle in my chest. Not anger yet, just the first clear recognition that the story I had been living inside was not the only one being told. I decided to speak to Michael first alone. I waited until the following evening when he came back from the marina office. We were in the living room. I laid the pages out on the coffee table and asked him calmly to explain the differences. He read them, then looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between irritation and calculation. He said the valuations were conservative for tax purposes and the transfers were internal moves between family entities. Nothing unusual, nothing I needed to concern myself with. When I pushed asking why he hadn't mentioned any of it during the insurance conversation, he told me I was overreacting because of the stress from the medical tests. That was when Eleanor arrived. She had let herself in through the side door the way she always did, carrying a folder of her own. She took one look at the papers on the table and the set of her shoulders changed. She didn't raise her voice at first. She simply sat down across from me, folded her hands, and began speaking in that measured, reasonable tone she used when she wanted you to feel unreasonable. The 5 lines she delivered next were not shouted. They were precise, each one designed to make me feel small for having looked small, for having asked small, for existing in the space between what Michael had told me and what the records showed. When she finished, the room felt smaller. Michael stood near the window, arms crossed, saying nothing. Eleanor waited as if expecting me to apologize for the inconvenience of my own questions. I didn't apologize. I gathered the pages, stood up, and told them both I needed air. I walked out to the dock behind the house, the boards creaking under my shoes, and called Jessica Hale. She had been my closest friend since we worked together on a harbor cleanup project 5 years earlier. I told her in short sentences what the report said and what Eleanor had just said to me. Jessica was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked if I was sure I wanted to keep pushing. The family was complicated, she said. Michael was under a lot of pressure with the business. Maybe this wasn't the right time, especially with the medical stuff hanging over me. I thanked her and hung up. The call left a different kind of cold in my chest than the one the medical results had created. It was the first small distance I felt opening between us. Later that same night, while Michael was in the shower, the phone rang. Dr. Lena Patel's office. The follow-up tests were scheduled for the end of the week. They wanted me to bring someone with me if possible. I said I would. When I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the dark water beyond the windows. Michael came out, towel around his neck, and asked who had called. I told him. He nodded, said he would try to clear his schedule, then added that his mother thought it might be better if I didn't mention any of the financial questions to the doctor's office. It would only complicate things, he said. People talked. I didn't answer. Instead, I went into the home office, closed the door, and opened my laptop. I emailed Victor Lang, the forensic accountant another colleague had used on a grant compliance review. I attached the pages from Derek Vance's report and asked if he could take a look at the full set of business records for Reynolds Waterfront Holdings. I didn't tell Michael. I didn't tell Eleanor. I simply hit send and sat there in the dark until the screen went black. The next morning, I found the envelope. It was in the bottom drawer of Michael's desk, tucked behind a stack of old Marina ledgers. The handwriting on the front was Eleanor's, the same careful script she used on every birthday card she had ever given me. It was addressed only to Michael, no return address. The seal had already been broken. I held it for a moment, listening to the sound of Michael moving around upstairs, then slipped it into my bag without opening it. I told myself I would read it later when I could think clearly, but the weight of it in my bag felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. That afternoon, Victor Lang called me back. His voice was professional, the way accountants sound when they have already seen enough to know the conversation is going to be difficult. He said he could start the review immediately, but that the initial discrepancies Derek had flagged were only the surface. There were layers underneath. He asked if I was prepared for what a full audit might uncover. I told him I was. Then I asked him to send the engagement letter to my personal email only. I hung up and walked back out to the dock. The water was calm, the same gray-green it always was in late afternoon. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. She said she had been thinking about our conversation and hoped I wasn't making any big decisions while I was still waiting on medical results. She meant well, I knew that, but the message landed like another small door closing between us. I put the phone away and stood there until the light started to fade. The envelope from Eleanor was still in my bag. I hadn't opened it yet. Part of me already knew that once I did, there would be no going back to the version of my life where I could still pretend the lies were small or accidental. But another part of me, the part that had sat across from Dr. Lena Patel and heard the careful voice asking for more tests, knew I was already past the point of pretending. I had hired the investigator, I had started the audit, I had the envelope, and the only person left to decide what came next was me. The next morning, after Michael left for the marina, I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope from Eleanor still in my bag. I opened it slowly. The letter inside was dated 4 months earlier, written in her careful script on heavy stationery from the estate. It was addressed only to Michael. She wrote that if I began asking questions about the property valuations or the transfers, he should frame it as stress from my work with the conservation grants. She suggested reminding me that wives in this family support the business, they don't audit it. There was a line about my upcoming medical tests making me emotional and prone to overthinking. She ended by saying she would handle any further inquiries on her end if he kept me focused on my health instead of the books. I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. My hand stayed steady, but the ground underneath the version of my marriage I had been standing on had shifted for good. This was not Michael hiding numbers on his own. Eleanor had been actively guiding him on how to keep me from seeing the truth. That afternoon, Dr. Lena Patel's office called with the next set of results. One marker remained elevated. They needed imaging and a biopsy to rule out anything more serious. She scheduled it for the end of the week and asked if I had someone who could come with me. I said I would arrange it. When I told Michael that evening, he nodded and said the new slip agreements at the marina were at a delicate stage and he would try to clear time. He did not ask what the marker meant or how I was feeling. He asked if I had spoken to his mother about any of it. I told him I had not. He seemed relieved. Eleanor called me the next day. Her tone was measured, almost gentle at first. She said she had heard about the additional tests and that the family was thinking of me. Then the edge returned. She told me that focusing on my health was the right priority, but continuing to question the family's financial arrangements at the same time was creating unnecessary stress for everyone, including Michael. She said some wives needed to remember that loyalty meant trusting the people who had built the life they were living. When I asked her about the letter I had found, she did not deny writing it. She said conversations between a mother and her son about protecting the family were private, and that reading it had been an invasion. She suggested I return it and move on before I damaged relationships that could not be easily repaired. I told her I was proceeding with the audit Victor Lang had started. She was quiet for several seconds. Then she said that if I continued down this path, she would have no choice but to involve Richard and the family attorneys to safeguard the business interests. She framed it as protecting me from making decisions I would later regret. I ended the call without promising anything. 2 days later, I met Victor Lang at a small cafe away from the waterfront. He brought a folder of preliminary findings. The irregularities went beyond the 2 properties Derek Vance had flagged. There were loans taken against multiple parcels using valuations that did not match the most recent appraisals on file with the county. Payments had been routed through holding entities that did not appear on the joint statements Michael and I shared. Victor said the pattern suggested someone had been preparing the books for external review or financing while keeping the real picture internal. He asked if I still wanted him to continue. I said yes, and signed the engagement letter on the spot. On my way home, I stopped by Jessica Hale's office. She was polite but kept the conversation short. She mentioned she had spoken with Eleanor and that the family was concerned about the strain I was under. She hoped I was not making any permanent choices while waiting for medical results. I thanked her for her time and left. The distance between us felt wider than it had after our first phone call. The biopsy was performed on a Friday morning. I went alone. Michael said he would meet me afterward if the meeting with the new tenant ran long. Dr. Lena Patel was there through the procedure, steady and clear in her explanations. When it was over, she told me we would have preliminary results in a few days and that I should rest. I sat in the recovery area watching the afternoon light move across the parking lot and realized I had stopped expecting Michael to rearrange his day for me. The expectation itself had become another thing I no longer carried. That evening, Eleanor came to the house while Michael was still at the marina. She sat across from me in the living room and spoke with the same calm precision she had used during the first confrontation. She said my decision to hire an auditor and to speak with a lawyer was escalating a situation that could have been resolved quietly. She told me that if I continued, the family would have to treat my actions as a direct threat to the business they had spent decades building. She said Michael deserved a wife who stood beside him during difficult times, not one who hired outsiders to pick apart the foundation. When I mentioned the letter again, she looked at me directly and said, some truths were better left between the people responsible for carrying them. I told her I had already scheduled a meeting with Rebecca Soto, the attorney who handled asset protection and financial disclosure in marital matters. Eleanor's expression shifted for the first time. She stood, gathered her things, and left without another word. When Michael came home, I told him about the biopsy and about speaking with Rebecca. He listened without interrupting. Then he said his mother was only trying to keep the family from fracturing under pressure that none of us had asked for. He did not offer to come to the follow-up appointment with Dr. Lena Patel. He said the business required his full attention right now. I went to bed that night with Eleanor's letter in the drawer beside me. I had not shown it to anyone. The next morning, Victor Lang called again. His voice was tighter than it had been at the cafe. He had cross-referenced older records and found signatures from Eleanor on documents that authorized some of the same valuation adjustments Michael had used. He said the pattern was not isolated to recent months. He wanted to meet again with the full set of findings. He asked if I understood that once the audit was complete, the information could not be put back in a drawer. I told him I understood. That afternoon, the text came from Dr. Lena Patel's office. The preliminary pathology required an in-person discussion. They had an opening the following day. I confirmed the appointment and did not tell Michael or Eleanor where I would be. Before I left the house the next morning, I placed Eleanor's letter in my bag, along with Victor's preliminary report. I drove away from the waterfront estate without looking back at the dock. The coordinates of my life had already changed. The only question left was how far I was willing to follow them. The appointment with Dr. Lena Patel was straightforward in the way medical conversations sometimes are when the worst has been ruled out. The preliminary results showed no malignancy. There would be monitoring and follow-up scans, but the immediate threat had passed. She explained the next steps with the same calm clarity she had used since the first call. I thanked her and walked out into the parking lot alone. Michael had not rearranged his schedule. Eleanor had not called to ask how it went. The relief I felt about the results sat beside a sharper recognition. The people I had expected to stand closest during uncertainty had instead used that uncertainty as a reason to ask me to stay quiet. I drove directly to the meeting with Victor Lang. He had chosen a neutral conference room at a small business center away from Annapolis. He spread the full audit summary across the table and walked me through the pattern without softening any of it. The valuations on several waterfront parcels had been adjusted upward for financing purposes and downward for internal records. Transfers had moved through entities Eleanor had signed off on years earlier. The letter I carried in my bag aligned with the timeline Victor had reconstructed. She had known the discrepancies existed and had coached Michael on how to keep questions from surfacing. Victor asked if I wanted him to prepare a formal summary for my attorney. I said yes. That evening, I placed copies of the audit summary and Eleanor's letter on the kitchen table before Michael came home. When he walked in, I told him I had the results from Dr. Lena Patel and that we needed to talk. He listened while I described the findings. His face moved through surprise, then calculation, then the same guarded expression he had worn during the first confrontation. He said the adjustments were standard practice in the industry and that his mother had only been protecting the family from unnecessary scrutiny. He did not deny the contents of the letter. He said some conversations were meant to stay between mother and son. Eleanor arrived 20 minutes later. She must have been waiting for his call. She sat across from me without being invited and looked at the papers on the table as if they were evidence of my disloyalty rather than theirs. Her voice stayed even, but every sentence carried the same precise contempt she had used from the beginning. You really think showing up with an accountant's report and a letter you stole gives you the right to sit in judgment of this family, she said. Michael has carried this business through every downturn while you've been focused on your grants and your tests. And now you want to punish him for protecting what we built. I kept my voice steady. I told her the audit showed more than protection. It showed consistent misreporting that could draw regulatory attention. I told her the letter proved she had known and had actively helped keep me from asking. She leaned forward slightly. You're using your health scare as cover to tear apart a marriage and a business that existed long before you arrived. If you cared about Michael at all, you would have trusted him instead of hiring strangers to dig through our records. But you've always been more comfortable with outsiders than with family. Michael stayed near the window. He did not contradict her. When I asked him directly whether he had known about the adjustments before the letter, he said his mother had been trying to shield him from additional stress. That was the moment I stopped waiting for him to choose differently. I stood and placed the copies in front of both of them. I said I had already spoken with Rebecca Soto about separating our financial interests and that I would not sign any documents related to the properties or the business until full disclosure was provided through proper channels. I told Eleanor that any further attempts to pressure me through Michael or through mutual acquaintances would be documented. Then I picked up my bag and walked out of the house. The next morning, I met with Rebecca Soto. She reviewed the audit summary and the letter and explained the steps for protecting my own position while the business implications were sorted. She said the letter strengthened any claim for full financial transparency. I authorized her to send a formal request for complete records. I did not ask Michael's permission. Elena Vargas, the compliance officer I had worked with years earlier on a harbor restoration project, returned my call that afternoon. I had reached out after Victor's second meeting because I needed to understand what the audit findings could mean outside the family. She listened without judgment and told me that if the misreporting reached certain thresholds, it could trigger reviews from lenders or regulators. She offered to connect me with someone who handled these situations quietly. I thanked her and said I would decide after speaking with Rebecca Soto again. Jessica Hale stopped returning my messages after that week. When I finally reached her, she said she had been advised by people close to the family that staying neutral was better for everyone. I did not argue. Another connection closed without drama, just quiet withdrawal. Michael moved some of his things to the marina office the following weekend. He did not ask me to reconsider. He said the business required stability and that my decisions had removed any possibility of that. I told him I understood. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. There was no raised voice, only the final recognition that the version of loyalty he and his mother had required was one I could no longer give. I stayed in the house for another month while Rebecca Soto negotiated the separation of assets. The audit findings gave us leverage for a fair division of the accounts that were verifiably joint. The properties tied to the questionable valuations stayed with the business side, which was Michael's to manage or defend. I did not fight for more than what was clearly mine. I wanted out cleanly. The health monitoring continued with Dr. Lena Patel. The results stayed stable. Each appointment I attended alone, and each time I left, I felt the same quiet confirmation that the scare had done what nothing else had managed. It had forced me to see the conditional nature of the support I had been given. Eleanor never called again. Michael sent one text about final paperwork. I answered it through Rebecca Soto. 3 months after I drove away from the waterfront estate with the letter in my bag, I signed the separation agreement. The document listed the assets we had divided and the boundaries we had set. There was no apology in it, no admission from Michael or Eleanor, only the legal record of what each of us would carry forward. I signed it in Rebecca Soto's office on a Tuesday afternoon. When I walked out, the air felt lighter in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Looking back, the weeks between the first confrontation with Eleanor and the day I signed those papers were the ones where I learned that choosing myself did not require their agreement or their understanding. It only required that I stop pretending the letter, the audit, and the silence during my medical appointments were small things. They were not. They were the evidence that the loyalty I had been asked to give had always been one-directional. I still live near the water, though not on the estate side. The monitoring with Dr. Lena Patel continues on schedule. Victor Lang's final report sits in a file with my attorney. Eleanor's letter remains in a drawer I rarely open. I do not need to reread it to remember what it cost me to see it clearly. The people who distanced themselves after I stopped accepting the version of the truth they preferred are gone from my daily life. Some days, that absence still stings. Most days, it feels like the necessary price of being able to trust my own eyes again. I do not regret the boundaries. I regret only the years I spent waiting for someone else to make them unnecessary. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever reached the point where keeping the peace required you to ignore what you already knew to be true, what would you choose?